Sounds good. Welcome to Podcast Matched.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
I'm excited for the chat because I've been getting big into photography ever since the iPhone 14 Pro came out.
Mm.
I've never had a Pro phone, so I've never had Pro Raw before, and at the same
Welcome to the
time,
party.
I was. What's that?
I said, welcome to the party.
Oh, thank you. And at the same time, my brother gifted me for a baby shower a fancy Sony mirrorless camera.
Very nice.
Has been a lot of fun digging into that whole world as well. So
Yeah, I have one too. That's the same combo I have. I have a Sony camera and the iPhone 14 Pro. So we're in the same photography league here.
excellent. So first off, I just want to dive into what your relationship is to the iPad.
So my relationship to the iPad, I mean, it's interesting because the iPad is a device that I always have wanted to love when I'm at home, and have like really struggled with finding a home for it in my like daily computing life, because
Yeah.
I'm either on my big XDR display on my desk, or I'm on my phone on the go, and I don't really like, in my current life stage with a baby, I don't have the time and space to sit on a couch with an iPad and like spend time computing on that. But where it has found a home is travel,
Yeah.
because when I'm traveling, I don't have my big display, but I'm still taking lots of photos, and it's really pleasant to edit photos on a big 12.9-inch display. Beautiful colors. You can really see the details in a photo. You can really get in the pixel peep. And the nice thing about it is, what I typically do is I go offline. I go into airplane mode on my iPad, and I have a terabyte of storage. And what I'll do is I'll just dump my Sony SD card into my iPad. And the reason airplane mode is important is because then iCloud doesn't offload them
Yes.
on me.
Yeah.
So like when I have terrible connection, I'm somewhere like in the mountains, I still have my files, and I do my culling, my flagging, my rejecting, my presets, my editing as I go, which then makes it much less daunting to come home and actually like have a final collection of photos for that trip. And so the iPad has replaced my laptop for when I'm traveling. And when I'm traveling, it's the opposite of when I'm home. I don't have the space to sit on my computer and like open it up and like really get into it. So the iPad is actually better for that situation. So as far as day to day, it's kind of like taking the place as my travel companion.
Yeah, and you've been on the 16 beta, obviously developing Darkroom. We haven't mentioned you're the co-founder and you're an engineer, so you're kind of very much into this app and making sure it improves.
Yeah.
How have you found reference mode on that? Do you have an XDR iPad Pro like an M1, or are you on an older model?
No, I'm on XDR with like a M1 Max MacBook Pro. So that's been how I've been working. And when you're referring to reference mode, you're talking about the external display support and
No,
that.
on the iPad, there's a new toggle you can turn on reference mode for the XDR screen
Mm.
on the iPad, so it like calibrates it to
So I have an admission. I have to admit something, which is, as you know, you're on the beta, so you know we've been quite busy with with a big release coming up, and we just had a release like 5 days ago, for preset sharing. So we've been in a really heads down mode getting those releases done. So I actually haven't gotten a lot of chance to really live with the iPad. And
all
in
good.
fact,
Yep.
so we also have a Catalyst app. So we actually built the iPad app in 2018, and we're running it on the Mac, and it's the same code base.
Okay.
And what's interesting about the Mac, and I'll circle this back to the iPad, so
Yeah.
you'll see why I'm talking about the Mac when you ask me a question about the iPad in a second, which is because they're using the same code base, things that the Mac app struggles with are things that the iPad app might also struggle with. And the reason I say might is because, for example, you can resize a window arbitrarily on the Mac, whereas you can't really do that on the iPad until Stage Manager. But
Right.
even then, like you have size classes, and the iPad OS will blur the screen while resizing. And so what we've been doing, where our focus has been as far as improving the iPad, has been on improving the performance and stability and reliability of the system.
Yeah.
And we're using the Mac as a stress test environment for the iPad. And so everything that we do to
Yeah.
improve the Mac app comes easily onto the
Yeah.
will map to the iPad version of Darkroom. And so it's the equivalent of when you're trying to optimize the performance of something. You don't want to do it on a high-end device. You want to optimize the performance on the low-end device, and then the higher-end device will be able to reap all those rewards.
Yeah.
But the Mac environment just exasperates any of the issues that we're struggling with on the iPad OS. And so things like multi-window support, resizing, all of those things are getting much, much, much better, even in the beta version that we're about to launch soon. And so we've been focused more on that, and that's taken our attention away from what we typically do, which is the moment there's a new announcement, a WWDC or a new Apple event, we drop everything and adopt it. So you're just catching me in an off cycle of of early adoption.
No, all good. So, I first want to ask, what's your relationship to photography and photographs? Like, has this always been a passion of yours? Like, why Darkroom for you?
Yeah, so my personal relationship to photography started around 10 years ago, and like the not very exciting answer is I just I saw some friends posting some nice photos, and at the time I had my iPhone 4S, and I was just like, wow, those photos are really great, and so I just got a camera because I wanted to make my photos look better. And the thing that hooked me with photography is that, unlike videography, you can put in a little bit of effort and have really excellent results. Just for like the payout ratio of effort to reward is really high with photography, and that hooked me. And then I just kind of like fell in love with um, like I'm taking all these photos that look really great, but then they're kind of sitting on an SD card and I don't know what to do with them. And so I started getting into like early Mac apps with the 10 years old now. Camera Bag was the app. I don't know if you've used a Camera Bag on Mac OS. It's one of those like indie apps. It's not one of the main ones, but it really gave me an insight into editing and made me fall in love with playing around with colors and making a look. And then I actually, at the time I was working at Facebook, and in 2013, I transferred internally from Facebook to Instagram, and I started working because of that passion for editing and photography. So I transferred to Instagram, and that's when I kind of got into mobile photography specifically. And at the time, the community was much smaller, and Darkroom and Instagram as a company was also much smaller.
Yeah.
And so I was able to really meet a lot of the people who were trailblazers for mobile photography. And the thing that they did that was insightful and early was taking mobile photography seriously and taking the iPhone and understanding and having a vision of what having a camera always with you in your pocket can do to photography beyond the megapixels and beyond the specs and beyond the glass and beyond the size and weight of everything. It's just we like photography because we want to tell stories, and like you can't tell a story if you left your camera at home because it's too big and heavy. And so I think the people I was exposed to and the narratives I was exposed to really took mobile photography seriously. And if you remember in 2014 when I started working on Darkroom, there were no tool. Lightroom for mobile didn't exist, and then there were no tools at all for managing a library that was consistently growing. And so that was my relationship was like my relationship with photography started just kind of early on, just trying to make photos that look better for me and my friends hanging out. And this was post college. We were going out, we were hanging out a lot, and I was the guy with the camera taking pictures. And my relationship to mobile photography started at Instagram, and the way that transitioned to the darkroom was just the insight that as more and more people take mobile photography more and more seriously, more and more professionally, we need tools designed and built for the iPhone and for mobile edited photography. So the distinction for us is mobile photography is not just on the capturing camera side, it's also the editing and the management side. And that's why we have an iPad app, and that's why we have a Mac app. Before Darkroom on the Mac, if you wanted to like access photos on your iCloud photo library, you really only had the Photos app. Like that's it. And so like if you wanted to do management or anything, you had to either do what they allow you to do or export them and then import them into a separate library. And that dual photo library is something, I mean, our entire like reason of being is we don't want you to import photos and export them and manage double storage, manage double libraries, have a really inefficient workflow. And so anyway, we like iCloud photo library has in a way grown to be the heart and soul of mobile photo editing. And anytime you have iCloud photo library, you should have Darkroom. That's our position.
Yeah. And so with the photo management, like if you favorite something in Darkroom, that's going to show up in the Photos app.
Absolutely, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I'm curious, there is extra stuff within Darkroom, like flagging and rejecting. Is that metadata that goes anywhere outside of Darkroom? Like, that's not something that Apple Photos directly supports, right?
So what we do is we currently actually use the photo. So when you flag a photo in Darkroom, we add it to the flagged album in the Darkroom folder. And so you can actually view all the flagged photos outside of Darkroom. Same with rejected photos.
Yeah. Okay, that's smart. Yeah. And those are the two big, I guess, management things within Darkroom.
For now.
For now.
Yeah. So the thing to know about Darkroom that'll keep coming up in this conversation is that we're a very, very small, independent, and bootstrapped company. So as of this interview, we have 6 engineers and 1 designer, and that's the whole, and like QA and customer support. That's the entire company. And so because of that, we have to really focus our effort and our resources on one thing at a time to be able to do it well, especially across all the image types and across all the platforms. As I mentioned before, we've been really working hard for the past few months on preset sharing and a couple of other updates that are going to come up towards the end of the year.
So you mentioned you had a Sony camera. Something I'm curious about is my Sony camera evidently does not have RAW support on the OS level, which is what you guys tap into. Explain a bit on like camera support in that whole rigmarole, because
yes, so it's a little so here's this. I'm the reason I'm hemming and hawing is I'm trying to think of where to start explaining this. There's like a 2-minute answer and a 10-minute answer. I'll give you the 2-minute version, and then we can talk more about it in detail if you want.
Sure.
But Apple provides, as part of the iOS SDK, Apple provides a set of technologies called Core Image, which most applications, not all of them, but most, we use to do image processing. As part of Core Image, there's this CI raw filter, which is the technical name for the raw engine. And so this is the component that opens DNG, reads the sensor data, and interprets it into RGB values that we can then work with.
Yeah.
That transition process is camera specific and manufacturer specific. And Apple is famous for only updating its software during major operating system updates. And Apple is also famous for having a lot on its plate. And so we are dependent on them updating support for things like compressed RAW format. So I have a Sony A1, which is one of the latest Sony cameras, and it does support iOS RAW. There is operating system support for that camera, but just not the compressed one. So you have to make sure you're not shooting compressed RAW. And that's a big issue with Fuji cameras. Sony now has compressed RAW. So that's the main thing you need to be wary of in terms of your camera settings. And the reason, that's what limits us. Now, there are other companies and developers who have built their own RAW engine. So the thing that goes from sensor data to RGB values. So I know like Lightroom has their own, Google has their own, which they use in Snapseed. I believe there's a Raw Power. Raw Power is another one. So the main developer, he built his own RAW engine for specifically like Fuji RAW files, and I don't know whichever other ones. Then there's open source LibRaw that you can integrate, but the problem is if you integrate that, then you're not using Core Image. And anyway, this is getting into the 15-minute version of the answer.
Yeah, you can use both Apple's technology and
you can, but when you're not using Apple's one, then you have to really not use a lot of the rest of Apple's stuff. Okay. Yeah.
It's not a huge deal because I just import in Lightroom or Raw Power and send the DNG off to Darkroom to actually touch.
Yeah, I mean, if our whole, like I mentioned before, our whole thing is around workflow efficiency, and if you have to import and export from apps, then you're kind of losing that beautiful workflow. So for me currently, and this is something we're working on, but it's not like it's a little ways away. It's probably a few months away before we start really getting into it and addressing that shortcoming of Darkroom. Yeah. Because so much other work has to go before we actually enable that, So what we typically do is we lay groundwork, and so big things come, but we've been working on them for about a year in the past. So that's the issue you're having there.
Right. And as far as RAW and Pro RAW and these DNGs, compared to JPEGs, what's can you explain what kind of better control you as a developer can have for editing? Because all the same controls show up there. You just have to explain a bit on the file.
RAW versus JPEG, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah. So, the main difference between RAW and JPEG that is useful for a photographer, so ignoring the technical details and the file formats and the file size and stuff like that, is from a photographer's perspective, the RAW file will have two big differences. The first is it'll have a higher bit depth, and I'll explain to you what that means. And the second is it's not compressed, and those are the main differences. And it's also extended range. So there's three main differences. So I'll explain all of them one by one. So the fact that it's not compressed is the biggest difference. So when you take a picture and you're capturing in JPEG, the camera itself is doing a conversion from raw sensor data to a compressed JPEG file. And the reason you would want to do that is because it's a much smaller file. And so if you're capturing lots and lots of photos, you're going to end up with much smaller images. Now, the other thing is that conversion I mentioned before, where if you capture raw sensor data, those are not RGB values. That's sensor voltage information. So you can't see it. It needs to be debayered, it needs to be sharpened, it needs to be processed, it needs to be interpreted, right? And in that interpretation process, there's also subjective decisions that need to be made around white balance, around tone mapping. Lots of subjective editorial choices are being made on your behalf to produce a JPEG. And so what you tend to have is a I don't want to say generic, but I want to say general purpose file at the end of that. Like, it's a file that will be the most appealing to the most number of people, and most people will actually be happy with the JPEG. Especially if you have if you shoot Fuji, then they have the film simulation modes that will inform how that transition from RAW to JPEG will happen. So you actually can influence some of the editorial choices being made in that JPEG compression process. The problem is, if you want to make any changes afterwards while editing, then a lot of that information has been compressed and flattened out. And things that may look smooth perceptually to us would not be smooth mathematically in the RGB values. And so if you then stretch two colors apart, rather than having a smooth gradation of values, you would see a block. And you would see just like a block of a single color and like flat edges. And those are JPEG compression artifacts. And so like
doing like a selective color edit to make the green
exactly
pop,
yep
those would not pop as well.
The easiest place to see it is in a sky, because the sky has like a smooth gradation of similar blue values. So if you reduce the luminance in the blue channel in Darkroom, for example, you'll see those artifacts come into play. If you increase contrast a lot, if you push shadows up too much, you'll see JPEG artifacts. Raw photos won't have those artifacts in them because each pixel is independent. JPEG is a lossy compression algorithm. That's how you end up with smaller files. It takes similar colors and compresses them to the same one because our visual perception system can't tell the difference. Yeah. But when you stretch it, then that's not true anymore. And so that's the first difference is the compression. The second difference is the bit depth. And so JPEG has much fewer bits per color than RAW. This is like a technical description, but all it means is you have 256 ways of describing blue in RGB. You have much more in 16 bits. And so like if you have two similar blues and you only have 256 ways of describing blue, those two blues that might be a little bit different would fall into the same bucket in JPEG, and in RAW they would be different. And so again, when you go to stretch them, not only is it uncompressed, so not only has it not been flattened for you, even if the colors are similar, you can still like find points in between two blues to differentiate. All of this, long technical story short, is it allows you more latitude when editing, so that you can push colors farther from where the raw engine interpreted those colors originally. And so if you're someone like me who really likes pushing their photo, you would want to capture in RAW. If you're someone who typically is just like adjusting colors subtly, then you don't need to capture in RAW. You can save yourself the performance and the memory and just shoot in JPEG. So that's the main difference. One other thing is future proofing, right? And so like right now you might not be able to do a lot of things, but in 5 years you might be able to do a lot more of them. So you want to capture and save as much data as possible, so that in the future you might be able to do more of it. And the only thing I would advise people against is becoming data hoarders. So like you might not need it now or in the future. You're paying a premium on storage, bandwidth, and performance and memory to process these raw files. So it's not a free, just let me gather more data for the sake of it situation.
Yeah, and call your photos. Just don't keep every little last one.
Yeah.
I was looking through from a couple of years ago. I got some blurry ones I was deleting. It's like, oh wow.
Exactly, and that's one of the areas we're actually thinking about how can we help people do that with less effort, right? Like that's one of those situations. Like keep your house clean, right? Clean up your room. It's like if it's one thing I have to clean, it's easier to do that than if I let myself go for 2 months.
Yeah.
It's easier to just shove everything under in the corner. So that's one of the areas where in the future we want to work on helping go from a cluttered library into a curated one with minimum amount of effort.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I noticed your app has a connection with Halide, and as does Halide. You can kind of shoot in Halide, hit a button, be editing in a dark room, and there's a button in a dark room to jump over to Halide. What's your relationship there?
I mean, we know Sebastian and Ben on a personal level. Like we all knew each other in San Francisco.
Yeah.
We all like and respect each other. I actually worked with Sebastian at Apple like 12 years ago. So like we have a personal history that kind of helps establish like trust. Beyond that, we also kind of want to do the same thing in the mobile photography space. So I think our goals and ambitions and tastes are aligned. I think the vision and the mission of both companies is aligned, and that's what helps us say, okay, like we both want the same thing. We just are both independent bootstrap companies focused on different parts of the same workflow. So let's try to make that as optimized as possible. So that's the nature of that relationship.
Okay. And something I get a little confused about when I capture a JPEG plus RAW in Halide, when I load that up in Darkroom, I can choose by default to open the RAW or the JPEG. When I'm editing, is it applying the edits across both files? Like, what's the linking files between the higher and the lower versions? How's it all work?
Yeah, so the way to think about it is you have edits sitting on one space and you have like the active photo on another space. And then you can choose whether the active photo is a RAW version or the JPEG version, but the edits will stay the same. And so what we're doing is like we switch from JPEG to RAW, then we just keep the edits but apply them to a different image. If you haven't made any adjustments, we allow you to switch instantly. If you've made any adjustments, we put up an alert to let you know, hey, by the way, like these edits might look different. Like be careful, like don't expect everything to be the same. Especially since we offer exposure only for RAWs, but not for JPEG. So if you made an exposure adjustment in the RAW, you go to JPEG, suddenly it looks different. And the reason we do that is because, again, we're mobile photography focused, and it's really, really difficult to get a badly exposed photo. Like you have to really do work and enable settings to underexpose or overexpose a photo on an iPhone. But we really want to have brightness. So for RAW, we have both, but they use different curves and they're used for different purposes. And our thinking there is RAW photographers are choosing to enter a more complicated workflow. And so we'll give them more options. But for JPEG photographers, we want to keep it as simple and accessible as possible.
I see, yeah. And something I noticed is live photos are actually respected in your app. Every other photo in your app just
crazy, right?
The data.
Yeah.
It's wild. It's
funny how that works.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
Is this, you guys also do video, like color grading, kind of same tool set, but for videos? It's kind of a side benefit, right?
Yeah, well, it's actually we've supported live video since 2017, and then we've only had video editing since 2020.
Okay.
The thing that's, I mean, I understand why other companies don't do it. It presents certain challenges, and so these are things that you wouldn't know until you like actually develop software or really pay attention. So we tend to pay attention to details and of iCloud Photo Library that most photographers, like most consumers, wouldn't, for a good reason. And one example of that is if you add a frame to a photo in Darkroom, we include the frame in the video, which makes sense. The problem is when you go to preview the live video in the Photos app, it zooms in the video. And so it ends up like making the frame not really match what you had wanted to do. And depending on the aspect ratio of the image in the frame, you might cut off like the video. Another thing is the resolution of the video is much lower than the resolution of the photo. And so when you go to like play it back, it looks not as sharp, so it can look a little bit different. And the last problem is, especially with what we've started doing recently in terms of image processing in Darkroom, with things like clarity, with things of some upcoming releases working on, is the amount of analysis we have to do on a photo and the different domains that we have to work on doesn't really work for video. So like video has compression artifacts, and like video has like there are things that can happen within a frame that as long as they're happening in other frames, it looks smooth. But if things are different from frame to frame, then it ruins your video. And so there are some things we can do for photos that we can't do for video. And so unfortunately, the two are started diverging a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. But I feel like there's something so beautiful and powerful about a live video, and like especially when you have people moving and acting and responding. So we keep supporting it because we think it's really powerful and beautiful. But I can see like another company making a different decision. We choose to focus on the emotional aspect of live photos more than the technical fundamentals of it. And so we allow the photo and the video to look different because most times you're not really going to notice a difference. And if you do, well, but we go out of our way to make the video look good. So for example, if you apply grain to a live photo, we'll actually make the grain jitter in the video so it looks natural. It looks like video grain. It doesn't look like photo grain. So we have two different algorithms, and we make sure we do the right thing there. Because if you just have like a flat grain, it just looks like someone slapped a photo on a video.
Yeah. And I really love the video portion where it is just a straight video, because you're looping a video just simultaneously, because you're not editing a video like LumaFusion. You're color grading, basically. Is that the best term for it? And
yeah, absolutely.
so
I mean,
the changes.
I think it's for to understand how we think about video editing in Darkroom. It's best to think of like understand the use case we're optimizing it for, and like everything starts for us from the fact that we're focused and optimized for mobile photographers and mobile videographers. And the reason we added video editing in Darkroom is because the destination for a lot of these photos is social media, and social media now became story. Ever since stories became the dominant form of consumption on social media, people are mixing photos and videos. And so the reason we added support for video editing is because we wanted the videos that people share to match the photos that they're sharing. So if you're going out on a trip, you can switch seamlessly between videos and photos, and it still looks like part of a cohesive set. So we think of video.
The copying adjustments, you could do your edit, copy those same adjustments across all the things in that same kind of trip.
Exactly right. Yep. Now, one thing that's interesting is by supporting video and photo, we've gotten really deep into thinking about the video space and the tools that professional videographers and video graders have, and how can we bring those to the video space and unlock those for videographers. So there's a lot more investment to do in the future for videography, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier with a small team, so we can focus on one or two things at a time. And the list of what we want to do is a lot longer than the amount of time we have in a given month to work on it. So we have to prioritize and choose what to work on first.
Yeah. So with the adjustments that you can make, how does your team kind of look at which ones to actually include? You mentioned exposure doesn't make sense for JPEGs, so it's include for RAW. Some apps you can fade both blacks and whites kind of independently. What goes into what you decide to include versus not include?
So what we don't want to do is turn Darkroom into a cockpit where every feature is available all the time, and you have a soup of buttons and sliders, and there's like 17 ways of doing the same thing, and that isn't a tool for mobile photography. That's a tool for professionals in a studio environment. And so that's every choice that we make as far as a new feature addition. There's two components of it. Does this need to be in a tool designed for mobile photographers and mobile photography workflows? And the second is, if the answer is yes, how can we redesign it so that it feels native to a mobile environment? And I think some of our competitors will go from the opposite way. So they'll go, we want to build this on the desktop environment, and we'll like shove this down into a mobile interface. And then you end up with like floating panels on both sides, and like sliders coming in from the bottom, and like menus inside of menus. And you're just like, I don't even know where I am or what I'm doing. It's powerful. You can do everything in it, but
yeah, I will tell you, my photos that I edit in Lightroom, I don't subscribe to. I did the trial just to see what it was all about, and I edited the crap out of those things because you had so many more tools, and my photos looked highly edited versus something like Darkroom. It looks more natural because you're not tempted to use all the crazy stuff.
Yeah, and there's also so there's a second component of that, which I'm glad you mentioned, because that's actually the second thing that we designed for and optimized for explicitly, which is the limits of sliders and the range of adjustment that you can do. We try to limit it so that you can't screw up your photo and then get it to a place where like, I've like made 4 adjustments and now it looks terrible, and like I don't know why. So we intentionally try to like limit the range. Again, this is a tool for mobile photographers. You're using your iPhone to capture photos. It's really, really difficult to get a photo like way off in white balance. You actually don't have white balance control, and so you don't need temperature controls that go from 0 Kelvin to set like 10,000 Kelvin, because then what ends up happening is when the range is too big, your finger is not a precision input device. And so then it becomes really difficult to get really fine adjustments using like a finger input. And so when, part of what is involved in building a tool, building a photo editing tool is every time you build a new slider, every time you build a new feature, you have a lot of subjective decisions. And usually these like sliders internally abstract away like 10 knobs, like how much of this color channel do we include on this kind of photo? How deep do we want to go? Things like that. And we make choices that ensure that your photo looks natural at the end of that. That's what we think mobile photographers want. And unless they tell us differently, that's what we'll continue to optimize.
Yeah. So one slider I'm very curious about is at the very bottom on the iPad. You can select highlights or shadows and choose a color and change the amount.
Yes.
Can you explain what this exactly does? I played around with it and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing with that slider yet.
Yeah, so that slider is doing split toning. And so you're basically saying, I want my highlights to be red and I want my shadows to be blue. So the way to kind of like think about it is if you make your photo black and white, you can tone the bright parts of the photo in one color and the dark parts of the photo in a different color, and they'll blend smoothly in between. That's actually one of the first tools we built in Darkroom, but it's also one of the tools that we're actually working on upgrading. And so where we want to take this in the future, hopefully sooner rather than later, I don't want to like sign up for specific deadlines. But if you go on our feature suggestion board, we say that this is in development. So like, it's not a secret that we're working on it. What we want to turn this into is a color grading tool. So similar to what you see in a video context, where you have lift gamma and like all those like color wheels. We want to turn it into one of those tools because I think that's a much more declarative and like intentional way of doing it. And that representation of like, here's a color wheel, and like I want my highlights or my midtones or my shadows to be this color, allows you to add side adjustments around luminance and saturation that I think can be really, really powerful for making presets, especially, and for like manipulating and shifting the colors in a photo. So that's definitely something that we're working on, something we would like to do. But to answer your direct question, it's split toning, but like we're going to be migrating away from that pretty soon.
Okay, and then one thing that I'd love to do in Darkroom that I do often in another photo editing app is a white vignette. Like it's
de-vignetting.
We've explored at all.
That is something we've explored. I think where we're stuck on with that is indicative of the challenge of building Darkroom, which is what I think you want is you want the ability to lens correct. You're taking a photo with a camera that adds a vignetting and you want to like correct that vignetting. Is that correct? Or is this more of a stylistic choice to like brighten?
During the day, I got a cute little baby in front of me. I want like more like angelic kind of like surrounding
glow,
a little bit of light,
Yeah. So for that use case, what we sometimes suggest to people to do is to use a radial mask and to just increase the brightness. If you want to use it for stylistic reasons. Because then you can control like the size, the width, the feathering,
it's very
right?
Subtle, like it's a 10 or 15%.
Yep.
Nothing too crazy.
Now here's the problem: is like it's simple to add a vignette slider. Usually people want to add a vignette so you can focus on what's happening in the middle of the photo. You just move the vignette and you're done, right? The problem with adding vignette on the other side is what people will what people want when you want like wider vignette is to fix for lens correction. And the problem is if that's what you want, you don't actually want vignette to go the other way. What you want is lens profiles, because each different lens will have a different amount of midpoint and a different amount of fall off and a different kind of like curvature that's specific to that lens. And so that's why in Lightroom it's under lens correction where you can like remove the vignette because it reads the metadata of your photo and it has a database of like, okay, for this specific lens, here's and there's actually like an open source database of transformations that define this mapping between a lens and a vignetting. So like we could add 5 sliders to vignette that control the roundness of it and the midpoint, but like that's going to appeal to so few people. And what you really want is like a switch, like correct for this lens, like you want a lens correction switch. And so that's why it doesn't have it, and that's why we haven't gotten around to building it yet. For the stylistic one, what we typically do is just a radial mask, and then because then you can choose: do you want to change the shadows outside of this area? Do you want to change the whole overall brightness? Like, do you want to do something different?
Yeah, and the masking is something I want to dive into because that's super impressive and not in many other apps. I mean, Lightroom has it. It's a high-end like subscription app. Your app.
It's hard to build. It took us a long time. That's why.
So
Yeah.
it blew me away the other day using the subject vignette because it
Yeah.
worked perfectly in this raw photo. It captured my newborn and nothing else.
Congratulations.
And, thank you. And then I then realized I can invert that to get everything in the background because sometimes the foreground background thing doesn't exactly do what I want to do, but that subject thing just I don't know what is that tying into iOS 16 at all, or what is it?
No, that's a machine learning model that's actually provided by iOS, and so
Okay.
we run that model to try to identify the contours of a subject, and so the masking feature was our first foray into machine learning and artificial intelligence in Darkroom, and so we use it for two reasons now. You called out the first, which is subject masking, and the second one we use it for is depth estimation. So if you open a portrait photo in Darkroom, you can select the foreground, background, change the blur in the background, and you can select any depth in between the foreground and the background and make adjustments that are depth specific. But what we actually do is we run any image, even if it's a big raw photo, through this machine learning model to generate a depth map and allow you to edit the background or foreground, which is really useful if you want to do like exposure, lighting adjustments. In a raw photo, it's really powerful to change where the lighting is coming from. It's kind of magical. So the subject AI specifically is similar to the one that Apple uses for their like subject masking, where you can pull a photo, pull a dog out of a photo and like copy paste it into something else. So it's using a similar mechanism. What's powerful is how we've integrated it into Darkroom, into the workflow in a way that's easy to use, and added support for all the different sliders and tools under that. So that's where the kind of the magic comes from that. And then you can duplicate, you can invert, so you can do all sorts of things with that. And then you can also add luminance and color masks inside of that subject mask, so you can select everything but the person, and then select the bright parts of the photo, the dark parts of the photo, or the blues, something like that. It's quite powerful.
And with the depth data, do you get? So the iPhone Pros have that LiDAR sensor, and at nighttime they'll use that for depth. Do you get any additional data when that is used to capture, or is it just all kind of the same?
We get, so if you capture in a portrait format, we get lots of information. So if you actually try Darkroom on a portrait photo, especially capture with a recent device, you'll see skin, teeth, glasses, hair, and you can just go crazy with it.
Glasses, mask, that's like a thing.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So like it's really great for teeth whitening. So you can actually make a preset where when you apply it, it whitens teeth if it's a portrait photo, which is like kind of blows my mind. Even sometimes when I do it, I was like, I can't believe we can do that. and those are provided by the operating system. So at capture time, the iOS is generating those masks for us, and those are high quality masks, especially the hair one. It's beautiful. And then it uses the LiDAR to capture a high fidelity depth map. And so when you're using a portrait photo, you're using all the LiDAR and everything to get a really beautiful depth. So actually, if you use a front-facing photo and you take a LiDAR photo there, and then you use the depth mask, and you move, if you move the depth slider back and forth, you can see just like it's getting the nose, it's getting the facial shape. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And so if you capture a portrait photo, that information is generated using as much information as possible at capture time. If you open a regular JPEG or a raw photo, we generate that for you using machine learning model.
I see. Gotcha. And then some masks, I kind of struggle with how to do them. Like, like linear mask is one example. Like, I'm making a line. Like, can you explain some of the masks that are less automatic in how to kind of what use cases are best for these different masks?
Sure, yeah. So a linear mask, quite simply, allows you to specify a start point and an end point, and then the start point is full effect, and then the end point is no effect anymore, and then it does like a smooth fall off between those 2 points. But it's a linear gradient, right, between those 2 points. So if you move them next to each other, it'll be a vertical mask. If you move them horizontally on top of each other, it'll be a horizontal mask. And the main use case there is if you have a landscape photo, you can create a mask that's the sky. You can create a mask that's the land. If you have a photo where you're looking at a bit of an angle, you might have a light fall off. If you have a building casting a shadow, you might have a line that's in the shadow. So you can create a mask to capture those areas. The radial mask is very similar, but instead of being a linear gradient, it's a radial gradient. So you can say a circular region of the photo. I want to edit everything inside of that or outside of that if you invert it. So inverting a radial mask is, like you said, really powerful. Well, the same way you've inverted a subject mask, a lot of people would create a radial mask, invert it to create a vignette or a bright vignette. And the use cases for that is if you want to like really focus in on a specific area of the photo, and you want to say, I want to get just this person in the distance, you would use a radial mask on that person. Or if you have a sky that's in the top right photo, you might want to create a radial mask around that sun and sunset photo to capture that specific region of the image. So each mask is trying to break down the photo in a different way. Then we have the 8 smart masks, so hair, teeth, skin, glasses. That's for portrait photos. Then we have the depth masks, including foreground, background, and the depth range. And then the subject mask is also available for every photo. So that's the full list. It's like 12 kind of, yeah.
And you mentioned that was kind of your first venture into machine learning.
Yeah.
There's other areas you're curious about investigating?
Absolutely. So we're actually like investing a lot in infrastructure right now to try to create a foundation. The future of Darkroom is going to be super heavy on machine learning.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you follow machine learning excitement that's happening on Twitter right now, but it's everything everyone's talking about, and you can see all the different ways that we might want to do that. We're thinking about all of those, but we're also trying to think outside of the editing interface. We're trying to think into the management aspect of Darkroom as well. And I mentioned before, one of the things we want to do is we want to take you from 400 photos you took on a big day of hiking or a big day of traveling, walking around a city, and get you down to the 20 best photos. Or how do I go from, I have 75,000 photos in my iCloud photo library, but really like I only need half as much of that because so many of them are duplicates. So how do I clean up that space? I'm paying for it. I'm paying bandwidth. It's like limiting me. It's so how do I organize and cull really efficiently? So we're thinking of all the different ways that we can introduce machine learning to Darkroom within and outside of the editing interface.
Very cool. Yeah. And then as far as the transformation tools, I really love all the grid options. Like a lot of apps just give you like just a grid, and you have all these different grids. And like adjusting like a crop during a live running video is also pretty powerful. Anything kind of worth pointing out about the transformation tools that you guys built?
Yeah, so the transformation tool is both our most used tool in Darkroom because everyone spends a lot of time in the transformation tool. But it's I think the transformation tool is actually where we're going to be investing a lot of energy and effort this coming year. I think there's a lot of room for opportunities for improvement there in terms of perspective correction, especially. Right now, you have to really understand how horizontal and vertical perspective kind of like interplay with each other. So that's one area of improvement we're going to be focusing on.
I want to make this look like I'm standing above the image, or I'm standing directly
straight on or head on or something like that, or at an angle. Yeah, exactly. So exactly that. So that's one area we're going to be focusing on. Another area we're going to be focusing on is we a lot of people use the transformation tool a lot because they want to get consistency for their social media profile over time. For example, like maybe you're shooting on an iPhone, which is a 4:3, and you're posting to Instagram stories, which is 16:9, and you just like all you do is like you just want to be able to say like, this is for Instagram stories, like help me compose this for Instagram stories, so that you don't need to go into the transform tool in the first place. And so another thing we want to do is like help you make better cropping decisions, and that's where AI might come into play. And so here's like a portrait of a person, but they're not centered, and like, but you're clearly not trying to go on the rule of thirds. It's just a badly composed photo. So we can help you do that. And so you're familiar, for example, with in painting, where you can like mask an area and like fill it in with something. There's also out painting with machine learning now, where you can like recompose the photos to like get something centered, so and like fill that in. So that would be those are like areas for improvement around both the workflow and around the image processing that we would want to do. So it is. I think that the thing that's notable about the transform tool compared to other photo editing apps is we try to really like prioritize what are you trying to do in a mobile interface, and how can we make it as smooth as possible. And so, for example, like we try not to overlay the cropped area with any Chrome So you can see exactly what your crop region is. And it's amazing how many photos will add like handles and will add like other stuff to the corners. So like if you're trying to get like something cropped out of the corner, like you saw a bush or like a sidewalk or something, you don't want to overlap any UI. So there's like 100 little details. The transition in and out of crop, like that introduced so much headache for us to try to get that. Like if you crop the photo and then you go into the transform tool, we uncrop it for you and we crop it back in. And that transition is actually really helpful, we think, for understanding like where the photo is in relation to the overall composition. And so we try to spend a lot more time on helping a mobile photographer understand where they're coming from and where they're going, and making the tool easy to use is where we're going to be investing a lot of time and energy in the future.
Very cool. And presets. I know you guys are very close to releasing this big update where you can share presets with other people.
We just released that.
Just released it. Excellent. So it's out now if you're listening, if you're watching.
Yeah.
And then something I just want to mention, I just love how you can change the strength of a preset. So you don't have to go all in on a preset. You can just subtly tweak it. I think that's great. I also love that when you hit a preset, you can see what was adjusted to make that. So just general thoughts on presets and like where they're best used. And like, I know there's like, some presets are designed to emulate a look of a certain camera and film and all that.
Yeah. So there's two kind of like historically there've been two kinds of presets. There's been what are called filters, like in Instagram, where it's a lookup table. You just like Visco, like Instagram. Those are LUTs. Those are just somebody designed a LUT and they sent it to you, tap it, and you're kind of good to go. And the problem is typically a filter, especially one that's like really exciting and like really impressive, will do a lot of transformations. But then you need to fine tune that preset for each photo. And so that's where like the LUT based approach kind of traditionally has failed. Then you have the Lightroom style and Darkroom style presets, which are collections of adjustments. And so kind of what we try to do in Darkroom is we try to give you the tools that those other companies use to generate their lookup tables. So rather than just sending you LUTs, we send you adjustments, JSON, that like was used to make that preset, which allows you to then go learn how it was made and also modify and manipulate it to make it your own and to make it fit your photo aesthetic properly. The thing that I think is a little bit important is important to know and unclear to people unless they really pay attention, is that there are actually two kinds of adjustments you can make in Darkroom. There's corrective adjustments and then there are stylistic adjustments. And corrective adjustments is if you take a photo and it's underexposed, you would change the exposure to make it look well exposed. Now, imagine you didn't do that. You just went and you applied preset. That photo is going to look underexposed in every preset you apply. If the photo is really flat, then it's going to be flat for every preset. So typically presets are designed for a well-exposed photo. And so what do you do if you have a badly exposed photo and you want to like apply presets? So what we do is we actually separate out the sliders that are used for correcting for exposure. So that's exposure, brightness, contrast, whites, blacks, highlights, shadows. And if you modify those yourself, when you go from preset to preset, we don't override them. And so we take it as a signal from the photographer when you increase exposure to plus 0.5. Is we take it as a signal from you that this photo is underexposed by half a stop. And so every preset should not modify your adjustment. So we give priority to the photographer. And so what we recommend for people to do is to, before you start going through presets, if you open a photo, if it looks great, jump into presets. But if the photo looks flat or if the photo looks underexposed or too dark, or like the main focal area of the photo is too dark, brighten it up with shadows, then go apply presets, and we'll make sure that the structure of your photo is maintained as you apply presets. So that's some of like the nuance of behavior that I think is important to know as a photographer who takes mobile photography seriously, but that's not apparent just as you navigate through the app.
Yeah. So explain the process a bit on the creating your own presets, naming those and sharing those. Like if I want to create a preset of, this certain forest I walk every day for my forest walk, and I want a preset of just that place where I photograph. How do I do that?
Yeah, so what I would recommend is you start out by thinking about like the mood. Start out with like a mood intention, right? If you live in England or in San Francisco and your morning walks include a lot of fog, it's going to be by nature a moody preset. Yeah. If you're in Los Angeles and it's bright and sunny all the time, like it's going to be a different preset. So think of what mood you want to go for.
And the time of day too.
Time of day. Yep. So start with that like intentionality, right? Like is the thing that I've seen some people do is they just start moving sliders around and like hope they like dumb luck their way into a look that looks cool, which can work. And we try to make Darkroom like we try to make people's experiences in Darkroom where you fall into a pit of success, right? Like if you just like move things around,
your image,
yeah, and it should look good. You should stumble into success. But if you're designing presets with the intentionality that you're describing, I would say start with the mood and then try to think of what you want to do with exposure for this photo. So I just mentioned I don't want you to touch the sliders for brightness, contrast, and saturation because those might be overridden by the photographer. But all those sliders, you can adjust them in curves. So for example, if you want your photo to be brighter, create a bow, right, in your curve, and that will give you brightness that won't be overridden by a user if a photo is underexposed. Yeah. If you want contrast, create an S curve in the curves. Don't increase the contrast slider. Then so once you've gotten the exposure of that photo, right, you might want to fade out the blacks, you want to fade out the highlights. Do that first because that's going to be the biggest visual impact of your preset. Then what you would do is you would go into the color channels, the red, green, and blue. And that's when you start manipulating the colors and the tonality. So if you want to go for like a really warm, deserty vibe, you might want to like reduce blue so that you get a yellower image. If it's really moody, you might want to go for like a red aesthetic. You might want to like change the tones for the highlights for the shadows. If you want to go for something cinematic, you might want the shadows to be more teal and your highlights to be more orange, right? And so that's where you add tonality. And then you go into the color tool, and that's where you start shifting colors around and manipulating it. And that's where you have to be careful because from photo to photo, you need to like, when you start working on color adjustment, you need to have a collection of photos that cover every color range because you need to understand bright yellows, like dark greens. You don't have to do this systematically, right? Like, but just do a spot check because sometimes you might be surprised what one preset does for one photo and what it does to another photo.
Yeah. Now when I copy adjustments, like, ooh, this does not work here.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of process for making presets that we would recommend. And then the last little tip is it's really hard to make one preset that works for every photo. You can do it. Yeah. We do it. Our bundled presets are intended to be generic, but it puts limitations on how far you can push a look. So for example, skin tones for all races kind of fall within the orange spectrum, right? And it's just like your luminance is different when you talk about like HSL. If you move people's skin tones too far to green, they look like they're about to throw up. And if you move people's skin tones too far to red, they look like they're sick and they're like have to have fever. And so you need to be like really careful about how you shift to oranges and yellows. But if you have like a desert scene or if you have a nature scene, it's really beautiful to like move those oranges all the way to like red or to yellow, right? Yep, exactly. And so like that might look terrible for a portrait. And so what I would suggest is if you're making a preset, think about what you're going to be using it on and like have some naming system, like have like an L for landscape, P for portrait, HC for high contrast, LC for low contrast. So come up with some kind of naming scheme that works for you. And what we'll do 100 to 400 sometimes, where the lower the number, the more subtle it is, the higher the number, the more intense the effect is. And have fun with it. Like I'm giving you all the tips. You don't have to use all of them. Don't think it's complicated. We try to make it as simple as possible. But if you really want to have like a set of photos that live next to each other in your filter in the preset tool, and you want it helps to kind of think about how it's going to be used and for what context.
And as far as sharing, is that person to person, or is there a community set up? Do you plan on adding kind of like a community preset thing within the app? Like, if I'm visiting New Zealand, I'd love if someone made a Middle Earth Peter Jackson preset for me to use.
Oh, I love that idea. Yeah. We are going to be investing in discovery for presets. So right now, the way is designed for one-to-one sharing, where if you apply a preset, you can tap on it again to see its options. You can tap on share, and we'll generate sample images and upload the sample images and the adjustments to the cloud, and then give you a link, and you can share that link with whoever you want. And like the way we designed it so far is, if I want to share a preset with you, I can just do that by sending you a message with that link. We wanted to see how the community adopted it and how the community kind of like created presets and like where they wanted to take it before we really start investing in discovery tools. But I mean, it's been amazing. I don't know if you've been following on Twitter. If you just actually search on Twitter for Darkroom preset, you'll see all the all the ones that are shared, which is really fun to see. So we're working on a way for you to discover those in the app, promote them in the app, and just like encourage discovery. So that's coming next year.
Awesome. And then I have two final questions as we wrap up.
Yep.
Smart albums, frustratingly, are not on photos on iOS, just on the Mac.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that is possible for Darkroom to fill that hole?
That is something that I've been wanting since we started working on Darkroom, and has been frustratingly out of reach until recently. So until the iOS 16. So in iOS 15 and iOS 16, Apple introduced a bunch of new APIs that enabled a bunch of new features for Darkroom. Of course, they're all secret, so we can't have started working on them in time for iOS 15's release. So like we haven't gone around to it yet. But what you need so here's what you kind of need to know. I'll give you like a slightly detailed answer. Cut me off if it's too much technical information. But iCloud Photo Library is a big database. You might have 70,000 photos in it. When you open a photo at like Darkroom, we have to fetch all the photos from Darkroom from the Photos app, which can be really slow. Some apps do this badly and can take like seconds for it to populate. So we try to do it as efficiently as possible so it's fast. But that limits our insight into what's happening in your library. Moreover, you can close Darkroom, delete half your library, and then you open it, and Darkroom is going to be out of sync if we do stuff out of sync of iCloud Photo Library. And so we have to be really careful. In the latest version of iOS, they've added APIs for us to kind of build our own complete insight of your database and catch it up to any changes that might have happened outside of Darkroom, which is a requirement for us to build indexing, smart albums, filtering, all the stuff that you want to see, but that doesn't exist, is now possible. We just have to finish everything we were working on and then start working on this, because now it's possible. Same with like edit syncing. So if you make an edit on your phone, we don't going to sync it to your other devices, because each asset on each device is unique, and we don't know that these are the same asset until iOS 15. And so now we can do it. So we're going to start working on it. But yes, those are frustrating shortcomings for like an asset management system. And we try to cover up for that as much as possible.
Yeah.
But we there's some things that we're fundamentally constrained by, just not anymore.
No, that's super exciting, because that's been like one big frustration. Because like I kind of want just a smart album to find all the camera images that don't have a lens metadata, because that tells me it's probably something I saved from Safari. Just want to delete that.
Get rid of.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like that would just be so nice. I guess
exactly.
Would do with that.
Yep.
So final question, iPad related. I'm very impressed with what you guys have done here. Like, you guys really take advantage of the platform. Like, you can open an image in a new space, and if you're in Stage Manager, that'll open a brand new window, so you can open up a bunch of windows that way. And then so just general thoughts on the iPad version versus developing for iPhone. And then also Apple Pencil, and this is probably very soon to ask, but this hover state in the M2 iPad Pros, any thoughts in how that might potentially influence future versions of Darkroom with Apple Pencil integrations?
Yeah, the Pencil one is going to be easier to answer, so let me just talk about that quickly, and then I'll talk about how we think about the iPad. The Apple Pencil is, the hover state is super cool, right? Like, that's one of the issues with the Apple Pencil is you don't know what's going to happen when you tap on it. So there's like kind of like this fear of putting pen to display. And so we're actually starting to integrate the Pencil more into Darkroom for upcoming releases. So very, very exciting to be able to like see that being invested in more and more, because I think that's the magic of the iPad. Like when you pull up the Pencil, especially in the context of photo editing, right? Like you want to be able to like brush, point, like select, stuff like that, like magic, right? So that's a big area of investment for us. Super exciting. It's also nice just to see Apple continuing to embrace it and invest in it. Sometimes you can kind of like hit the writings on the wall for some things Apple does. You're just like, oh yeah, this hasn't been updated in a long time. Yeah. So it's nice to see that this is a focus for them. When it comes to how we think about the iPad, one of the things that we strive to do, and one of the reasons why I think we won an Apple Design Award, is because we try to be as good platform citizens as we can be. We think that's what makes us mobile first. That's what makes us optimized for a mobile environment. And we think it's really silly that some apps kind of treat their iPad and iPhone as just kind of, and I think it like is indicative of where you're coming from, right? Like if you're making all your money on the desktop and these are just like portals into your cloud or into your desktop client, it's going to be different than if if you're going from the iPhone and expanding into the Mac, right? Like the directionality there really matters and influences what the product looks like. And so like I appreciate you noticing that, because we spent a lot of time working on that. And that's very intentional. Like that's not accidental. Like we want Darkroom to take full advantage of everything that iPadOS can do.
And the layout
And that's
is
what
very different from iPhone. Like it's
very different,
an
yeah.
absolutely different app, and it should.
But if you resize it to a narrow window, it'll adopt the iPhone interface. So it's fully, exactly. So it's fully responsive. And that's because it's the same app using the same code and it's the same components. Like they're just being laid out differently, but they're being laid out radically differently. And so we take a lot of pride in that, and that remains a focus on us. So where we this goes back to my point earlier about focusing on the Mac. What's been happening with the kind of convergence of iPad and Mac is, things like keyboard navigation is powerful in Darkroom, but there's like a couple of other steps we can take. And unfortunately, what's been happening is like, Big Sur was the first Mac version that had Catalyst, and then Monterey and now Ventura, and each iteration makes big differences to how keyboard support works because they're improving and iterating on it. And so we're focusing on getting all our infrastructure and platforms updated, because the iPad app is now built in 2018, and like the right way to build an app in 2018 isn't the right way to build an app in 2022 and 2023. And so we're working on updating our infrastructure to take full advantage of the latest keyboard, cursor, now like window resizing, making that super smooth. So that's where our area of focus is, and that's where you're going to see the biggest improvements in Darkroom moving forward.
Excellent. Yeah, the cursor, you can do so much with it.
Unbelievable. Super cool. Yeah.
Imagine it like locking onto a slider, so you're not worried about it still on the
And we spent any person who's done mobile photography and used a mobile photography tool on an iPhone knows that like sometimes you lift your finger and it shifts the slider by like 1 or 2%, and it's super frustrating. So we spend a lot of time on like helping you get back to zero confidently, helping you like be confident with your finger and like mouse input. And that comes into play with the cursor. Like it like ties in naturally.
Yeah. Ferrite does this thing where you hold down, I think, an Option or Shift, and it transforms it to the cursor being a totally different thing. Like it's selects audio versus the standard pointer. I'm curious, like using like modifier keys, if you hold down like Option 1 or you're sliding, if it like slow down the slide to make it more granular.
Yeah, we've been thinking about that actually. We've been playing around with adopting what like iOS used to do, but I think still does, where the distance from the knob changes how responsive it is. So you can like start dragging but move your finger up or down to like make it more finely responsive, so you're moving like half points. So we're playing around with ideas like that. The main challenge there is discoverability. And so like if something is worth doing, is because it's useful, and if it's useful, you want to make sure it's discoverable. And so that's what we play around with. One thing that we spend a lot of time on is try to understand intent from user actions. And so like we try to make the app really, really simple to do. But if we're getting like feedback and intentful actions from the photographer, just like, oh, I want to take this further than you're letting me, we try to think of ways to like allow you to do that.
Yeah. Well, there are so many more things I'd want to dive into. It's so impressive with your app. Like if you guys haven't downloaded this app, it's free to download. And then there's free trial, and then you get started, or you can just pay the lump sum to have a lifetime subscription, which I love.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love that there's like watermarks you can throw in your exports. Like every aspect of this app is just very well thought out. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
This awesome app.
Thank you so much, Tim. Appreciate it. And thanks for the conversation.
Where can people find more information about Darkroom?
What I suggest is people follow us on Twitter. That's where like we're most active in terms of engaging with the community. There's also the subreddit Darkroom app. The Twitter is use Darkroom. And on our website is like the most in-depth information about all the updates we have, all the little bug fixes and everything that goes into them. So yeah, definitely go to darkroom.co for the latest information.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been just
absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.